This has been organized by the Forest Peoples Program, the Tenure Facility, Middlesex University, the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic, and the Land Portal. It's my very great pleasure to be the moderator for this event. I'm Jonathan Watts, the Global Environment Editor of The Guardian, the founder of the Rainforest Journalism Fund, and a co-contributor to a new book, Standing Up for a Sustainable World. We have an amazing response to this webinar. More than 1,000 people have expressed an interest in this event, and I think that shows just how important this issue is. More than 2.5 billion people from indigenous peoples and local communities live on and manage more than 50% of the world's land area through customary or traditional systems. This includes some of the most important and biodiverse forests in the world, and numerous studies have shown that, I beg your pardon, and numerous studies have shown that the protection of indigenous and community rights is the most cost-effective and effective way of protecting those areas. Despite laws to supposedly protect those rights, they have formal legal ownership of only 10% of that land that they look after. And another maybe 8% has some degree of government recognized management rights. It's a somewhat precarious situation. And when indigenous and local community rights are not recognized by governments, it can lead to poverty, conflict sometimes, environmental degradation, and there is a growing awareness amongst academics, NGOs, global policymakers that the tenure security of indigenous peoples and traditional communities is a prerequisite for achieving national and international goals for forest governance, also for food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. So crucially important, but this is contested. Obviously, there are forces we know that resist this and are trying to roll this back. And we are seeing that now. It's since last year and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a shift in absolutely everything, and that includes in health policy, the economy, and while people, citizens, are focused on health and financial concerns, some governments are using the pandemic as an opportunity to prevent change or even to roll back policies that could protect and guarantee rights for indigenous peoples. In some cases, indeed, it's either been the pandemic has been weaponized or been used through a form of sort of malign neglect, and this is having a devastating impact. And before we get much further, I just want to look at very briefly at a victim of the health crisis. And yesterday it was announced by the Brazilian indigenous organization COIAB that the last male member of the Juma people, his name was Aruca Juma, died of COVID. This is an extraordinary tragedy. The Juma used to number 15,000 people at the start of the 20th century, and now the last man in that community has gone. It's the extinction of an entire people. And before we go any further, I'd like us just to have a few moments of silence to remember him and all the other indigenous victims of COVID. Okay, thank you. Now let's look forward. Let's look at how we can analyze the situation, how we can change the situation. Today, we are going to get a summary of the Forest Peoples Program global study, and this will be followed by a discussion amongst our esteemed panelists who come from Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and Peru. You, the audience, will be able to participate. We'll be taking questions from you, and we will ask you for a short, there'll be a short sort of online poll very shortly. Before we do that, let me introduce my co-participants, the other panelists. I'll start with Cathal Doyle, who is the author of one of the authors of this paper. He's a senior lecturer at the School of Law in Middlesex University and a member of the Forest Peoples Program Board. Then we come to the other members of our esteemed panel, a very fabulous depth of knowledge from across much of the world. That we have delighted to have Rukka Sambolingi, who is the first female Secretary General of AMAN, which is the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, the world's largest Indigenous peoples organization. Rukka, hello Rukka, is a Torajan from the highlands of Sulawesi. I'm told she is a fiery orator, so we had better watch out. I also know she's got a gorgeous dog. So if her video link goes, we might get a glimpse of that. Next up, we have Raiz Perez, who is the president of the Wampis Nation in Peru. His organization has defended against extractive threats and focused on their own way of development and sustainable conservation. Then we have from Colombia, Camilo Nino. Hello, you, and sorry before, hello Raiz. Camilo is the speaker of the National Commission for Indigenous Territories Observatory of Colombia. He is a leader of the Arhuaco people, an ecologist, and a master of rural development from the Pontifical University of Javeriana. And then finally from Brazil, we have Viviane Rojas Garzon, who is a lawyer and coordinator of Instituto Socioambiental. She is a political scientist, a specialist on environmental law, and she has worked in the Amazon and on indigenous rights since 1988. Before we get into this, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded. There will be a video available on the Land Portal website later. We have, as I mentioned before, more than 1,000 participants signed up. There will be live tweeting. If you want to hashtag, it's COVID rollback or Indigenous peoples. You will be able to send in questions throughout. You should, at the bottom of your screen, see a little button for asking questions. Please use that for questions rather than the chat room. There'll be welcome chat rooms throughout, and it's great to see many of you from all over contributing already. Hello, everyone out there. Now, let's have a quick icebreaker so that we can know who is out there. We'll have an online poll that should appear on your screen and help us to get to know each other. The first question that you should now see is, please can you click and tell us in which region are you based? You should see that up on your screen now. And you see the 5 choices. Please let us know which of those it applies to you. Where are you from? Where are you now? And then you can see, then I'd like you to answer the question, which sector do you represent? Are you from the government, civil society, NGOs? Are you private sector, international organization? Or are you an academic or an other? I guess I would be an other. I think I've been an other all my life. Okay, so I hope you've all clicked on that, and we should quite soon see the results. They should appear on our screen. Okay, let's see who we are, who's out there. Now, it seems like the majority of people are from two regions, North, South, and Central America, 41%, Europe and Central Asia, 44%. So about equal between the old world and the new, as they used to be known. Then we have 11% from Asia Pacific, 4% from Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa, and just one person from East and North Africa. Hello, that one person. Thank you very much for representing your area, and thank you all. Now, and I should say, in case you're curious, I'm from, my region is Pimlico in London, where it's the sun is coming down and it's a little cool. I hope it's warmer and brighter wherever you are. Now, which sectors? Let's see who you are in terms of sectors. Yes, a good spread, 39% civil society, 21% international organizations, and then also good representation of universities, government and private sector. I think we get the idea here that we have a very diverse audience with representation across a lot of regions and a lot of sectors. So welcome to you all. Now, one more question I'd like to throw at you. And this is, how do you feel about the impact of COVID on nature? A very subjective question in many ways. There's no right or wrong answer here. But do you think that COVID-19 has helped the environment or made the environment worse? And again, there isn't a right and wrong answer. This will totally depend on your region, what kind of habitat you live in, urban or rural, and on how you interpret the environment, how you see nature. So from your perspective, has the environment improved or gotten worse? Let us know what you think. I mean, obviously you might say, the air quality is improved, or I see more deer in the streets, or, all these stories we've heard of how things have changed as humanity's retreated, and there are less cars on the road. So let's hope everyone's answered that, and let's just see that answer. Wow, a total split down the middle. 50% think the environment has improved as a result of COVID, and almost exactly one person more, in fact, says that things have gotten worse. Now, I think this is crucial because this is about perceptions, and it's about distance, because many people in consumer cities, urban cities, feel that there have been gains in the environment because there's less cars on the road, there's less pollution, and also maybe many people who look at the world on a global level can say there have been some gains, because we all know carbon dioxide levels have gone down. But the situation is very different for people on the front line, for those in remote areas often, which is actually perhaps the most important area of biodiversity in the world. And these are areas, of course, where you tend to find traditional communities and indigenous people. And there the picture's much more mixed. Sometimes things might be a little better, often it's much worse. And in terms of political protection, in terms of support from the services, all of those things can also happen. And that is what we are here to discuss. And so with this, I'd like to hand over to Cahal to tell us the results of the study. What have you found about the effects on indigenous communities, indigenous rights?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to share my screen and put up a few slides as I talk about the report. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. As Jonathan said, I'm going to speak about the global report and its findings and recommendations, and the other panelists are very well placed to speak about the situation in their countries. So early in the pandemic in 2020, Indigenous people started to alert international allies, human rights organizations like Forest Peoples Programme of government plans and initiatives to roll back social and environmental safeguards with very serious consequences for their rights and territories. And given these very concerning reports from the ground, Forest Peoples Programme, our partners and allies, felt it was important to undertake systematic analysis to understand the extent to which this is happening in Indigenous peoples' territories in the 5 most tropically forested countries in the world. FPP therefore came together with the Lowenstein International Human Rights Law Clinic at Yale Law School, with Middlesex University School of Law, and with researchers in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and the DRC to attempt to answer this question that you see. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, to what extent have governments in the world's 5 most tropically forested countries rolled back on environmental and social safeguards? And what are the consequences of this for Indigenous peoples and their territories? So the approach we took was to conduct country studies in 5 countries in collaboration with local researchers and Indigenous peoples organizations. And the research relied on academic journals, white papers, media reports, and importantly, information provided by Indigenous peoples and their organizations to build a picture of rollback in each country. We focused on 4 areas where rollback was being reported. Firstly, macroeconomic policies and land use plans. Second, impact assessment, consultation, and consent seeking processes. Thirdly, impunity for land grabbing, illegal mining and logging activities. And then fourthly, and very importantly, increased levels of violence and criminalization of Indigenous and community leaders. So our findings are very stark. We found clear evidence of rollback in all these areas. Social and environmental laws, regulations, and safeguards have been weakened, purportedly in the name of economic continuity and recovery, with no consideration given to the very profound implications of this for Indigenous peoples and their territories. And the consequences of this are serious in all 5 countries. So this roll guard of safeguards is already affecting Indigenous peoples and the integrity of their territories, and it will continue to do so and to cause even greater harm if not reversed. These rights violations are structural in nature, and they're by no means new. So what we're seeing is business as usual, but its destructive impact is significantly intensified at a time when Indigenous peoples and other forest-dependent communities are at their most vulnerable and unable to defend their rights. Some have put it in this way: harmful business as usual, but this time on steroids. The report has 4 main findings. The first is that governments have prioritized the expansion of energy, mining, logging, and agribusiness activities in or near Indigenous territories in the name of economic recovery, while at the same time weakening safeguards and violating Indigenous people's rights. The second is that governments have aided and abetted or turned a blind eye to land grabbing for illegal deforestation, mining, and agricultural activities in Indigenous territories. As a result of this, deforestation continued to surge in 2020 and shows no sign of abating. Third, changes to policies and regulations governing land use to enable commodity production and extractive industries have been rushed through during the pandemic. And these further weaken social and environmental safeguards, including consultation and free prior informed consent. And ultimately, they facilitate the systematic violation of Indigenous people's rights. And fourthly, Indigenous peoples who attempt to assert their rights are facing alarming and increasing levels of violence, arrest, and criminal prosecution. So these findings give rise to serious concerns. We expect that these rights violations will accelerate as governments become increasingly focused on pursuing so-called economic recovery at all costs. But such an approach to recovery it's not only ethically and legally wrong, it's also counterproductive and totally unsustainable from an economic and environmental perspective. By undermining Indigenous peoples' land rights, governments are endangering the most effective solution for protecting the world's biodiversity. As guardians of 80% of the world's biodiversity, Indigenous peoples are responsible for a huge portion of the $33 trillion which the World Economic Forum estimates intact biodiversity contributes to the global economy. So protection of Indigenous peoples' rights and tropical forests are inextricably linked. Much of the world's remaining intact tropical forests and habitats are part of Indigenous peoples' territories. And their traditional stewardship and sustainable use of these ecosystems are essential in tackling global climate change. Research has repeatedly concluded that the most effective way to protect forests and biodiversity is to respect Indigenous peoples' rights. However, rather than partner with Indigenous peoples to ensure sustainable long-term recovery, short-sighted governments are instead rolling back rights safeguards, and in so doing are imperiling the customary owners and traditional managers of the world's biodiversity and all of our futures. And we believe that without concerted action to address and halt this trend, further erosion of Indigenous peoples' rights and destruction of the biodiversity and forests in their territories is inevitable. So this year, as we all know, the world's governments will come together at the UN Climate Change and Biodiversity conferences. And among the most important commitments that they can make at these events is to halt and reverse rights denying and environmentally destructive rollbacks, and to ensure effective protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in their territories. And given the central role which Indigenous peoples' tenure security and traditional knowledge play in combating both biodiversity loss and climate change, it's essential that negotiators at these conferences put Indigenous peoples' land, autonomy, and territorial rights at the very heart of climate change and biodiversity targets, investments, and strategies. So what needs to be done? Well, the report has a series of recommendations, but I'm going to just give you a sample of 4 of those. Firstly, governments of tropically forested countries must reverse these safeguard rollbacks. They must end the criminalization of Indigenous leaders and prosecute those responsible for violating their rights. They need to partner with Indigenous peoples to realize sustainable recovery that respects their rights and protects their forests. Governments in consumer countries, including the US, the EU, and the UK, must consult with Indigenous people to develop human rights and environmental due diligence legislation for their global commodity supply chains and associated finance. They must also use political dialogue and cooperation agreements to influence governments of highly tropically forested countries to reverse and prevent the weakening of environmental and social safeguards, and to ensure effective participation of Indigenous peoples in pandemic recovery activities. International financial institutions such as the World Bank should urgently assess both the risks and the opportunities in COVID-19 recovery and interventions, and develop strategies that prevent rights violations and also directly support Indigenous peoples to strengthen their autonomy and territorial control. Multinational corporations, financial institutions, conservation organizations need to adopt policies and implement due diligence practices in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with zero tolerance for threats, attacks, and human rights violations against Indigenous rights defenders. So in conclusion, Indigenous peoples' collective rights are recognized at the international level. These self-determination rights now urgently need to be realized in Indigenous peoples' forests and territories. States have legal obligations to uphold and protect these rights, and doing so is necessary for Indigenous peoples' survival and for the future of our planet. Indigenous peoples themselves are responding in the face of extraordinary difficulties, and they're doing so by demarcating and monitoring their territories. They're strengthening their self-governance institutions and economic resilience, and they're developing free, prior, informed consent laws and protocols. And all of this is to realize greater territorial control and self-determined development. However, even during a global pandemic, when Indigenous peoples attempt to assert their rights, they experience violence, intimidation, and criminalization. Their governments are failing them. It's our shared responsibility now more than ever to stand with Indigenous peoples and support them in their struggles. As Joanne Carling, Director of Indigenous Rights International, affirms, a pandemic can never be an excuse to trample upon human rights and destroy our planet. Rolling back environmental and social protections in the name of promoting economic recovery is adding insult to injury for Indigenous peoples. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll all read the report.
Thank you, Cathal. Fascinating, horrifying, sobering, and yet very constructive in not just the problem, but what we can do about it. I remember at the start of the pandemic, writing some stories about Brazil and the fears of many indigenous rights groups and environmental groups, excuse me, that the pandemic would be used to kind of push forward more extractive industries in the Amazon and elsewhere. As you say, it's kind of extractivism on steroids, which is horrifying. And governments are failing really on a massive scale to protect Indigenous rights. Now, that was the big picture look at what's happening. Now let's hear from those who are on the ground, who are directly, or contacting people who are directly affected. I want to start with Brazil, partly because it's the place I know best, but also because we've all seen what's been happening there in terms of the forest fires, the deforestation, the violence. We've heard that the environment minister there, Salles, is actually said, let's use this quiet period during the pandemic, by which he means the media quiet period, so that we can push through other types of deregulation, by which he means weakening the rights of Indigenous people. Viviane, can you tell us, has there been an increase in land grabbing since the start of COVID-19? What's happening on the ground?
Buenos días. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Realmente es un honor poder estar aquí compartiendo.
Good morning. Thank you for this invitation. The first thing I'd like to say that the person that contributed directly with this report on the crisis pertaining to pandemic and Indigenous people in Brazil is anthropologist Thaisa Nodelli, that has prepared this report and is part of the Social Environmental Institute. Quickly and to the point, today Brazil is facing a serious crisis in the increase of deforestation, primarily within Indigenous territory, which is nothing new, of course, But together with this pandemic and the choice of President Bolsonaro and an administration openly against indigenous rights has had disastrous effects as regards the territorial rights, right to life and self-determination of indigenous peoples. So it's a set of elements that characterize this threat. And what we would like to systematize this in two aspects. One that has to do with the expectation, a change in legislation, indeed, a deliberate of government of promoting regulatory changes, not only administrative, among which that they are responsible, and progress has been made in of dismantling public policies, as well as the public entities related both to indigenous rights and protection of forests and Amazon forests. So there's an administrative aspect, and it's responsibility of Bolsonaro's administration of eliminate public policies and to weaken public institutions pertaining to oversight, control of indigenous territories and of forests, primarily in the Amazon region, but of the indigenous people like the Indian National Foundation, which was dismantled and taken over by persons such as police officers or evangelists that was tried to evangelize indigenous people. And on the other hand, a true expectation for change on regulation in Congress, in which government has no power, but that are being promoted by the executive branch and that generate a specific expectation in the territories that are threatened in the border of the Amazon, that indigenous land for conservation may legally disappear. So this combination between the administration restrictions and an expectation of regulatory change has led to a true increase of deforestation within indigenous land territories without precedent, indeed, prior to Bolsonaro's administration. And this what has changed currently, which was reinforced due to the pandemic. What we do have a demoralization of indigenous land as legal entities that are threatened due to the reversal of legislation. So this in the practice has led to an increase in the past 2 years of deforestation in about 80% within indigenous land prior to 2018, prior to the election. Now, with the pandemic, that deforestation process has continued to rise, and together with the fact that at first with the pandemic, some oversight teams and policing that did oversight in this area did not withdrew, and as they were asking for results of Amazon protection led to a change of administrative operators for oversight purposes. And this meant that withdrawing specialized agencies with experience in that area that knew how to fight against deforestation and organized crime associated to the deforestation, the illegal mining, illegal which is IBAMA as Semibio. These agencies were removed and they reduced the resources to have an impact, and their staff was withdrawn. And in replacement, they brought the army, the Brazilian army, that has no experience to fight against deforestation. And by using more resources than the specialized entities, was unable to actually reduce the rates of deforestation. So that's roughly the general outlook of what is taking place in Brazil as regards change of regulation.
Muito obrigado, muchas gracias, Viviane.
Thank you very much, Viviane.
Good of you to, you know, you've described how the deforestation has increased, the oversight, the protective bodies in the government have been weakened, and you talked about increased mining. Just a quick follow-up, and I'm just looking for a brief answer, but could you give us an example when it comes to mining? I know that's something that, for example, David Kopenawa Yanomami said to me he's most worried about mining, illegal mining. Is this expanding, and if so, where? Can you just, during COVID, how is COVID affecting the mining situation in the Amazon?
Bueno, hay tres frentes de expansión grandes, que son el territorio Kayapó, los territorios Munduruku y los territorios Yanomami. Voy a dar un ejemplo solamente para tener una dimensión de lo que está ocurriendo. En el territorio Kayapó, el aumento de la deforestación asociada a la minería ilegal,
Deforestation associated to illegal mining in the last 4 years, because this is not exclusive of the Bolsonaro administration. In the last 4 years, it's twice of the deforested area in the last 30 years due to deforestation associated to illegal mining. So today, we do not have a small-scale mining, but rather than a criminal large-scale structure mining that is damaging forests and rivers, etc. So the Bolsonaro administration in February presented a bill in Congress so that illegal mining activity will be legalized, and this has stimulated exponential growth in those 3 indigenous areas I mentioned.
Thank you. That is a very alarming development that does not get enough international attention. Thank you for raising that, and thank you all as well. Just before we move on, on the chat, there's a lot of constructive comments, a lot of offers of support. So please keep that going. That's really good to see. Let's move now to Ruka in Indonesia. Hi, Ruka. Now, we heard in that report from Kahal that the Indonesian government has, or parliament, has introduced legislation to weaken environmental protections, and has also sort of introduced, or at least accelerated, the concept of indigenous lands as abandoned lands. What's your response to this? How can your organization and others deal with this and turn something bad into something positive, or stop it altogether? Hello? Did we? Oh no, did we lose Ruka? We seem to have lost Ruka. My apologies. I hope one of the technical team can try to re-establish a connection with her. We are kind of spread literally across the world here, so this is to be expected. But let's shift, shall we, in the meantime, to Colombia and Camilo. Camilo, hello, are you there? Hola. Camilo, I can see you are on the screen, so I'm assuming you can hear us. Let me ask you a question. I know things are being translated, so there's a little lag. But in Colombia, the report has told us that the government has introduced a change to land use practice, that the government has deprived indigenous people of their customary land rights. Can you please tell us more about this, and how is it affecting people in practice? Uh-oh. Camilo has now disappeared from my screen as well. Camilo, hello, he's back. He's back, but I cannot hear him. Camilo, hello. Hello, Camilo.
Sí, aquí estoy. Aquí estoy.
So
Buenos
here I am.
Hi.
Yes. Good
Great,
morning.
thank you. Did you hear my
afternoon,
question?
everyone.
And can you respond?
Sí.
Yes.
En primer lugar, buenos días.
Yes. So first of all, good morning, everyone. Everyone who is connected and online. Apologies, I have an internet connection issue. Well, the internet, it's been an issue for all of us here. So, okay, in Colombia, we have had a huge challenge, especially for those specific lands, as you mentioned, in the change of land use policies. And as a consequence, we have been deprived from territories that belong to communities, especially those that do not have a proper titling. So this has created huge challenges, and especially we have two main problems. One related to the administration issues. Based on the argument of the pandemic, they said that the whole processes cannot move forward when trying to legalize territories. I think we lost him again.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to hear that, because that sounded a very important contribution, but hopefully we can reestablish a connection and catch up with some lost ground. This is it's a bit of a massacre of our contributors at the moment, online terms at least. We have 3 of the 4 are offline at present. So until we reestablish a connection with them, I think I'll go back to you, Viviane, if you don't mind. And on the issue of mining, we know that there's been, from a government level, some rollback, some weakening. I wonder if also Indigenous people's rights and protections and support has been hurt just generally by the lockdown, because support groups such as Instituto Socioambiental and other NGOs, maybe you guys are following the quarantine rules and not going to these areas, but meanwhile, the loggers, the miners, the land grabbers, they're not following any quarantine rules at all, and they're going in. So it's almost open season for them. And I've heard that, you know, for example, in the Xingu area, that, you know, there are moves to start a huge new mine called Belo Sun, and that now that there's kind of no alternatives, maybe some people who previously resisted Belo Sun, they're not hearing an alternative. They're only now being under pressure from mining companies, from those who want to push ahead with these projects, even though these projects will damage their land in the long run. That's all they're hearing, because COVID has actually altered the debate. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, about the interactions with Indigenous groups and riverine communities in that situation. And then maybe we can go to Camilo, because I think he's back. But Viviane, if you could please go first. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Voy a rápidamente para...
Thanks. I'll move quickly so that we can have Camilo back answering his. question. So probably the most important issue to highlight is the profit of government, the companies facing this health crisis due to the pandemic. It is probably amazing to see the efforts to provide health services and information for the understanding of the disease and the practices to prevent the contagious different contexts in the small villages where they have a very different collective social relationship. The government has forgotten about that. On the other hand, Bolsonaro's administration has misled and miscommunicated. And then probably one of the most important things they did was to organize themselves at the end and on the disease and the ways to protect and themselves and to internally safeguard if that's have been done by different indigenous organizations and it's an independent impartial movement of the different records of people that have died or that have COVID in order to have a specific record for indigenous peoples only. So the whole European indigenous people are out of that public um, list. And on the other hand, we have industries creating exceptions for the prior consultation processes within the territories. And they have promoted together with the government this free prior consent online via online meetings. So they have tried to replace the regular meetings with some other small changes in order to get the development approval by some members of the community. So it's a very opportunistic way to get and solve this issue.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And a very important point about these virtual meetings instead of face-to-face meetings and the problems that can bring. I'm delighted to say, not only is Camilo's apparently here, but we now have Ruka back with her cat, hopefully. We'll get on to you in a minute, Ruka. Let's first try Camilo because I asked him a question and he got cut off. Camilo, can you hear us? And can you now answer the question about how the land use practice has changed in Colombia?
Sí.
Yes.
En ese punto estamos hablando sobre el punto en el cambio del uso.
Yeah, the change of use of land. You are referring at is we have seen a fall of oil prices and an increase in gold price worldwide. And this has led to an economic reactivation, and therefore it is affecting indigenous territories. And the consultations have become key for this process. And the whole pre-prior consultation process has been changed. So it's been simplified in order to get the environmental approvals faster than usual. And the government wants to minimize the process of consultation because it does not really provide the proper warranties for the real compliance of this specific right. So those are the main challenges we've been facing.
En Colombia tenemos un problema de
In
formalización.
Colombia, we have a huge problem of land formalization. Currently, in the National Land Authority, we have more or less 556 requests for land titling. But last year, this national authority only worked with 23 cases out of those thousands of cases. So at this speed, at this pace of formalization, it will take us 47 years in order to get all these different territories and lands formalized. And related to the peace process, important for Colombians as a whole, because after the signing of the agreement, we have identified that there were no significant development on the whole comprehensive land reform. So we do not have a clear idea of which are the investments that be presented to get approval. So this could be the main summary of what is happening, and we see a lack of concrete response on the government side based on the requests and demands for our lands.
Thank you, Camilo. A quick follow-up to this. You mentioned that the government has slowed down in its process to recognize indigenous land rights, and at the same time, you still have a lot of tension and conflict. And you know, we know also that palm oil, for example, is as you're saying, is expanding. Can you tell us, is this leading to more violence, more conflict because of the sort of instability over who owns the land? And if so, how have you responded? How has indigenous people in Colombia responded to that? Hello, Camilo, are you there?
Sí, escuchan.
Yes, great.
Buenas. En Colombia, el tema de las consultas
Well, in
previas.
Colombia, the prior informed consultation has been seriously affected because the Ministry of the Interior, which is the one who is supposed to guarantee the indigenous people's rights, have been implemented several practices.
¿Me escuchan? Hola.
Can you hear me? I think
Hello,
I'm
we
just
can hear
cutting
you
off.
intermittently. I think you need to, maybe if you can talk very directly into the microphone, we can hear you and then not. So.
Hello.
Camilo, I think we've lost you, or on and off. I think if we can try and stabilize your line a bit, I'll try and get back to you. But in the meantime, Ruka is back. At least her dog, not cat, her dog is back. Sorry to your dog. Ruka, it's lovely to see you and have you back. Can you tell us now, the report, Cajal's report has told us that legislation by the government has weakened environmental protections and introduced this concept of indigenous lands as abandoned lands. How have you responded to that? How has it manifested itself in Indonesia?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. In fact, the concept of indigenous land in Indonesia being vacant or is not something new. In nearly all planning processes since the beginning of Indonesia as a country, the reality that 40 to 50 million indigenous peoples occupying about 52 million hectares land throughout the Indonesian archipelago has been ignored by the economic powers that be including government planners. The internationally, that's the term that has been the invisible pupils. And this is due to the fact that we indigenous peoples have not been considered a development asset, but we rather a development liability by the state, and therefore ignored or even intentionally made invisible on maps designed to facilitate land grabbing by corporations. And of course, this is a global problem that is not unique to Indonesia. And we've been talking about a lot about the data desegregation at international level. What the report point is to is the recently passed ambitious consolidating legislation in Indonesia. We call it Omnibus Law on Job Creations. It says job creation, but it is not actually. This law is designed to facilitate local and international investment into Indonesia and reduce the existing few safeguards to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and our environment, our only Mother Earth. But also equally important that the way in which we, the indigenous peoples, interact with our territories and resources is also invisible to the government's planning and resource management actions. The indigenous peoples, in fact, we are self-sufficient and we provide what globally called environmental services. These services are biodiversity protections, watershed protections, and we are keeping massive amount of carbon in our forest. From our maps, indigenous maps Indonesia that we have in Aman now, it's more than 10 million, nearly 12 million hectares. 63% of this forests are good forests and storing nearly 9 billion tons of carbon. And these are all the carbons like above the ground and under the ground. But sadly, Jonathan, that all these global priorities and programs designed to support the forests or climate at the moment have yet to, into any significant way, benefit indigenous peoples who are actually, who are actually providing these services. And this is because of we are continue being denied our rights as indigenous peoples, and we are continue to be invisible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rukai. You made an extremely important point there. I think that indigenous people are not being recognized by governments as a development asset. They're seen as a liability, and this kind of thinking is behind so many of the problems that are faced not just by indigenous people, but by countries. Because as you're suggesting, indigenous people can be part of their economic recovery. They can be part of the solution. Everyone's talking in the world, not everyone, but a lot of governments are talking about a green recovery. Indigenous people should be front and center in this green recovery, and support from them should be part of this green recovery. So I think this is a really fundamental point point that you raised. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Right, we are at the point where we're scheduled to go into question and answer. I hope we've received lots of questions from you in the audience. Please remember you can, not the column on the right, but at the bottom of the screen, you should see a way to send in questions. We've already started to compile one or two, which I will forward, or I will say to the participants that we have here. I would just add, I think this is, thank you to the contributions, thank you to this lovely audience out there, that Camilo was having some technical problems. So if you look at 3:59 p.m., for example, Adam Lun has helped to answer one of the questions I addressed to Camilo on the issue of increased attacks and criminalization of human rights defenders. That there is a map out there showing the links between the two. There's a lot of great resources out there. Maria Arango too has offered resources to help answer the questions. We are having technical glitches, but the humans are working together to try and solve it. Thank you all. So let's now move on to the question and answer section. I have had some of these forwarded to me from Neil Sorensen, who none of you can see, but he's behind all of this organization. So let's start with question number 1 from Michael Rice. This question is an open question to all panelists. Where has the push for deregulation and rights rollback come from? Where has it come from? Is it the case that industry has seized the opportunity to justify rapid expansion to boost the economy? Or is it the case that governments in the study countries already had these plans and they're just using the pandemic to push them forward more quickly? So, you know, they can avoid awkward questions, avoid protests on the streets. So the question is about the drivers behind the trends, the drivers behind the rollback. Is it industry? Is it government? Any of you, Ruka, you missed part, so you're welcome to take that first, or Cahal, if you want a big top-down view on that, or Camilo, Viviani, I'm happy to take any of you. So whoever wants to chip in, raise your hand, and let's take it there. Okay, Viviani is the first to raise her hand. We've got quite a lot of questions, so if people could keep their answers relatively short.
Vamos a rápidamente. En el caso de Brasil,
very quickly, in the case of Brazil, it's a political partnership with agricultural and livestock, agro industry, to try and make use of these land for the commodities. And the Amazon is the place where there's greater production of maize, and in the indigenous regions that they want these to be a production space for commodities.
Thank you. Ruka.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. That is a very good questions, but I think we all knew the how the corporations have been really taking chances and even make the best out of people are hiding, because we are hiding. We are really hiding. We are on the lockdown after the pandemic started in Indonesia since early last year. The plan is, I could say, the concessions, the plan, the economic concessions is already there. And it was already mentioned by the president during the inaugurations earlier in 2019. So the what happened is they pushed through the legislation and they try to make sure that all the deal that they have signed materialized or happening during the pandemic. So that's the problem for us, because when we are on the lockdown and then suddenly we have ongoing land grabbings, the numbers of land grabbings in Indonesia, and also when they're making, they also make the opportunity, they take advantage during the pandemic to really kick us out of the decision-making processes, because there's no way we can participate the public hearings, for example, during the pandemic, because it's just impossible to risk our life to go to see them. And then the other thing, I think it's very important that it's very clear answer from this pandemic that the global economy is failing. The current structure is no longer feasible. We need to restructure. We need we've been talking about paradigm shift for decades. This is the time. This is the time. When the government still dealing with pandemic from the economic perspective, and we are actually unfolding oncoming pandemic in the future. And that's also what the message we received from our elders from indigenous territories. The upcoming pandemic, this pandemic is just unfolding. If we don't change the way we treat our nature, the way we treat our human being, and then we are going further into the catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you. Another really important point there, that indigenous people and these territories, they are not just a potential part of a recovery and a solution, as you said previously. They are also essential in preventing a pandemic happening again. So this is like a double function. It's right at the center of things, instead of, it's not at the periphery at all. It's at the center of this pandemic, and should be treated as that. Thank you, Ruka. I'm going to try Camilo again. Let fingers crossed. The link is there. I cannot see you, Camilo, unfortunately. Your face does not appear on my screen. So I don't know if you're raising your hand, but I would like to get you involved. So let me just see if we can connect with you and if you can answer this question about what are the drivers of these terrible trends.
Yes.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, in Colombia, we are facing a phenomena, and currently we're implementing the reservations, and this is linked to the construction of infrastructure. For example, they're trying to connect the Colombian Pacific. And this becomes even more serious as a result of the pandemic, since this has brought to light issues or problems that have increased lately. So in Colombia, we say that the pandemic has shown the pandemic of what's occurring in indigenous lands, whilst indigenous people are trying to see how we're going to face the pandemic to reduce the impact. On the other hand, the Colombian administration is trying to implement means, practical means that are failing to contribute to the right, which was talking about virtual prior consultation that is not ensuring effective participation. And a problem is what's taking place today as regards connectivity. For example, how can a government guarantee when rural areas have practically no connectivity? 83% of national territory is not connected, and that's why I've had problems. I'm an area where my participation is highly limited, and this is what's occurring. The second point I'd like to talk about, that there's increased in the violation of human rights that has to do with murders to social leaders. Since we signed the peace accord to date, 312 indigenous people have been murdered last year. Since the pandemic started, 140 members of indigenous peoples have been murdered. That represents a third of these cases, and this is mainly due to murders taking place to social leaders that are defending the territory. So there's an environmental massacre behind it. Secondly, the pandemic has also led to the removal of traditional ancestral knowledge, since the elders are passing away. The report that we have of deaths as a result of the pandemic is among the spiritual leaders, and so there's cultural knowledge that we're losing in our people, and in some cases so serious that it has affected peoples with very tiny population. A week ago in Colombia, a great leader passed away who represented several indigenous leaders, and this is a significant impact. Something else that we have identified, there's a lot of forced displacement and confinement of indigenous communities as a result of the presence of attacks by armed groups for the dispute of territorial occupation. And this has meant that indigenous tribes have faced hunger and have lost their territory. Another aspect that we have identified as a result of the pandemic is that countries do not have the capability of reaching remote territories, and that's why connectivity is not only the internet. Connectivity is because these areas have no access, they have no roads, airports, etc. So there's no cultural approach. There's a reduction in the guarantee of rights as regards consultation. There's intervention in the territories by multinationals, and there's an increase in the presence of armed groups and limited institutional response of the guarantees to protect our land. And today there's great concern which should be addressed globally, and that the Colombian Amazon region, all the peripheric areas of the Colombian Amazon is being deforested. And this not only affects indigenous people and Colombians, it will have an impact, and it will have an impact on the globally. And since the National Commission of Indigenous Territories, we have expressed several times that to defend territory is to defend life. And we have to join efforts among all of us in the different parts of the world, because we're seeing this. We heard our friend Ruka of what's taking place in Indonesia, what's taking place in Brazil, and thus we have to come together in order to face this problem. The pandemic is bringing an end to several indigenous people, and then action of the institutional response has not been effective apart from the multinational aspect in the region.
Thank you, Camilo, for a very powerful intervention there. Your descriptions of the military situation, the situation of violence and threats, is very alarming. Also, it's important, again, to stress that point you made about the question of connectivity, and if free, prior, and informed consent has to rely on internet connections. We've seen today very clearly how difficult that is, and in a way it's a handicap for people who live in remote areas, and that seriously has to be borne in mind. And finally, that point you make about the importance of this globally. It's not just a question of communities in remote areas. This is of global importance. This further underscores those points that Ruka was making about the positive contribution that needs to be made, and the central position that indigenous land rights need to be in as part of a green recovery. No point building lots of wind farms and solar panels in rich countries if you're destroying the forests in Colombia and the Amazon and the Brazilian Amazon. I'm just quickly, I think I'll just go to Cajal if that's okay, because unfortunately Raiz Perez was not able to join us today, probably for those same connectivity issues. I can't ask you to speak on behalf of Peru, but you probably are familiar with the situation there from writing the report to some degree. And I just so that we can get a little bit of the Peruvian element in this, as it's an important part of the report. What's your impression that what are the drivers of the trends you're talking we've been discussing here?
Yeah, it's a shame Raiz can't be here to give his perspectives, because coming from the Wampi Nation, they have a really inspiring story of how indigenous people is asserting its own autonomy and coming up with solutions to problems that they didn't create, and the state's blindness really to the role Indigenous peoples play in addressing these three major challenges. We talked about biodiversity, climate change, but also pandemics, these three challenges that we are going to face as a global community. But in Peru, as in all the other countries, these issues are so structurally entrenched, and to try and unpick whether it's the state or companies, that are causing this rollback, this is always such complicity between both sets of actors, that it's always challenging to try and see where the issues come from. In the Peruvian context, for example, there has been huge devastation of territories in the Amazon by oil exploitation over 50 years. The state and companies have failed to remediate this, and it's my view, having been to these places and worked with some of the communities, that it's probably impossible to actually remediate this. But in the context of the pandemic, what we're seeing is the state-owned Peru Petro, which is the state oil company, coming together with the Ministry of Mines and Energy and saying that the oil and gas sector can be the motor for recovery from what the country is suffering as a result of COVID-19. Again, Indigenous peoples' issues don't even come into the discussion, and yet we're in a context where there are such profound harms that need to be remedied. And this is going on, as I said, for 5 decades. I don't think there's anything new here. It's just that Indigenous peoples are in a position where they're less maybe able to challenge this, and it's an opportunism, taking advantage of the fact that the economy is, all economies are suffering, but looking at the old ways of doing things rather than facing these really 3 core challenges that we all face collectively as a global society. And just to link in very quickly to one of the questions I saw around due diligence and why is this important? Well, I think what we're saying in the report and what Indigenous people are saying is that governments that are home to the supply chains for commodities or extractive industry companies, they can play a really important role if they listen to Indigenous peoples in how to develop this due diligence guidance. And things like Viviani talked about the free prior informed consent protocols and laws that communities have developed. Well, if companies were required to respect those in their processes, it would change the whole scenario. And it wouldn't address the illegal activities, but it would at least free up Indigenous peoples, their energy to try and tackle those rather than also be confronted with large scale companies that are coming in and ignoring their rights in complicity, complicit with the state actors. So it's a very complex picture. There's many elements to it, but I think that each different actor can play their part in addressing that and trying to basically empower and support Indigenous peoples who are the main actors here and who are driving these changes and who have driven change in environmental law, in human rights law. They're really the tip of the arrow in making this change happen. And this relates to climate change and biodiversity. So we need to talk to them and see how we can best help them and direct it. That goes from financial side, technical side, work in collaboration with them. So I didn't get into Peru in that much detail, but I think it's common issues that we're talking about across all of these areas.
Thank you very much indeed. No, I mean, can't expect you to represent another country, but just didn't want them to be completely missed out just because of the technical problems. We've had absolutely heaps of questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all. In theory, there's only 10 minutes left. I think if people are willing, we could run on a little bit. I see that's a suggestion in the comments. But let's try and at least do one more question to everyone, maybe 2 more. Here's a question from a journalist that I'd like to ask the country participants. And it's from Virna, my glasses are not very good, Virna Setiorini of Antara in Indonesia. Please forgive me if I mangled your name. She has asked to all the panelists, is there a win-win solution for economic opportunities and the fulfillment of the rights of indigenous peoples and deforestation reduction? If so, what is that win-win solution where we protect indigenous rights in the forest and promote recovery and growth and improve rights? Ruka, this is close to your area to begin with. Could you start with the answer on this question, please?
Yeah, hi Firna. Thank you very much for joining tonight. I know it's late now, but thank you very much for making the time. There is no such win-win solution. At this point of time, it is the win for all, or we are all being a loser in the end. Yeah, at this point of time. So win-win solution has been the language that always being used actually to trick us down, because they always say, we'll give you money, you win, we win. Never, there is no such thing. And especially at this time, we see the global economy is collapsing, to be honest. And this is so scary to see it. So now and in Indonesia, we have proven as well that the economic valuations of our indigenous territories, as you speak about money from the economic perspective, we are actually contributing bigger amount of money than what those private companies are contributing to our local development. So when we talk about what is next, what is our better life, and I think this is the time that we need to all come together. We are not against corporations, yeah, because indigenous communities in what small scale is also a corporation by itself. But how we do break down all this, and then we can actually build better connection together from us, indigenous peoples, where all the resources are in our territories. How can we transmit that in more equal and better situation, rather than what we have now, which is what we have now is only benefit the few, but the one that is being the companies now, they're very few, but they all in the end become a loser like us if we don't change right now. That's from my perspective.
Thank you. And your perspective, Ruka, had a lot of agreement on the chat room. Several people saying, thank you, yes, it's win-win that got us into this crisis, is Alfred Bronell. Others say, yes, agree, no win-win solution at the time being. There is no win-win, we are living in the age of the Anthropocene. So yes, a lot of support for your view there. So, well, I'd still like to put this question to Camilo and Viviani. Let's slightly rephrase it, and let's just say, what would you see as the best way for indigenous communities to be protected and to contribute to the recovery that everybody needs in our, not just economic, but in our health, in our well-being, in our climate? I think the problem is often we just look at everything in economic terms, and that's always too narrow and always benefits a small group. Well-being is about so much more than how much money you have, obviously. So Camilo, can you answer that? Can you, if the line is good now? Silence. If you can hear it, I'll try to.
Jonathan. Here I am, Jonathan. I think that's a very important question, actually. There's something that we have been requesting, asking for a long time, and I do share the comment that somebody sharing in the chat. We have to be more inclusive. Like, we're talking about collective territories where we have the different populations within Colombia. And one way to solve and protect these different peoples is to guarantee a legal protection. That together with conservation may probably a solution. That the communities of indigenous peoples' lands are where the most forested areas are located in Colombia, and we may have a solution for climate change since we know how much this is affecting the world. Everybody will be affected by climate change. Indigenous people, we already have the knowledge, the traditional knowledge in order to provide that know-how to adapting to climate change. Therefore, we can probably promote governments and states to contribute to is though and implement this sort of knowledge, because lots of the violence we have been experiencing in many territories because of the lack of legal security in our lands, like in the case of Colombia. We do not know exactly, for instance, whether the state actually knows how much land we actually have. So to have warranties for collective land rights will reduce or will protect those areas and territories, and that will help us avoid the negative effects of climate change, and that will benefit all of us, all the humankind at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Camilo. I wish I could see you to wave at you and nod in agreement with you, but you have my sympathies and appreciation. Viviane, how about in Brazil? Can you give us the most positive outcome you can imagine in terms of the situation there?
Entonces, yo primero quiero declarar que estoy absolutamente de acuerdo con Rupe y con Camilo.
First of all, I'd like to say I fully agree with Ruka and Camilo, and perhaps at the beginning, this is not an issue of the indigenous people, nor deforestation, nor climate change, nor pandemics, nor river or land pollution. It is a problem of these people, of our people. Before we start talking about corruption, or if there's a win-win, there's some accountability have not been done honestly, and the situation of the planet today and the global challenges that we have as the humankind have always been unbalanced, primarily on the backs of the indigenous people, of traditional communities that are in the border territories, which are the final territories left to achieve this balance. And that's a consequence that we have to acknowledge so that we can strike true partnerships, not only for morally reasons or historical recovery as humankind, but also as a survival instinct. If we're unable to strike true, honest partnerships with the indigenous people, we will have no chance of maintaining a dignified life as a species. And that's not only the territories, but also their knowledge. We need a true alliance and partnerships. We have, us, non-indigenous. It's not for the indigenous, but rather for the non-indigenous and for humanity and the species as a whole, because of distributing work and the problems as if those of others will not lead us to a solution.
Thank you very much indeed. That really kind of underscored the urgency of this, and goes back to what has become a recurring theme, which is that we really shouldn't be treating this as a peripheral issue in a remote place. This should be a central issue. And I must just, we've actually reached the normal end, or the scheduled end of this panel, but I just want to continue just for a tiny bit more. First of all, a little housekeeping before I ask for a final comment from everybody. Please check the chat. It has some very useful links to the report itself. which I think is important. I highly recommend you read it. A lot of useful data and information there. There are a number of other useful links and resources that people have kindly contributed. I should stress there is also a survey on what you think of this panel, and please look for that link. And if you have time, it would be great to get some feedback. And then there is an admonition of me, a very gentle one, of where I have failed to stress, in that I've stressed indigenous, but of course this is not just about an indigenous issue. It's also about traditional communities, riverine communities. It's about Afro-Caribbean descendants in Colombia, or known as quilombolas in Brazil. So this is a, you know, there's a lot of different groups under this umbrella, and I apologize if I've kind of, just for the sake of brevity, if nothing else, tended to stress indigenous rights, but in fact there's a lot more to it than that. I'd like to, I mean, I'm sorry, there are many questions we won't be able to get around to, but I'd like to finish on a positive note, or a forward-looking note, let's say, at least. Yes, okay, you know, we can see the situation is pretty grim, but perhaps each of the contributors we have, the panelists we have, can look forward. This is a big year. It's a year of the Kunming Biodiversity COP. It's a big year of the Glasgow Climate COP. There's a lot going on in terms of corporate due diligence, governments. If the panelists can make one suggestion for international policymakers, or it could be international corporations, or it could be their own governments, if they could stress one thing that they would like to see changed, so that this situation in which indigenous people, traditional peoples, Afro-Caribbean Afro-descendants, at this moment when it's very difficult for their voice to be heard as before, because they can't march in the streets in most countries. The internet connections, as we've seen, are not great. How can we amplify that voice? And what one thing would you suggest to kind of stress for a positive change this year from these sort of international actors, some of whom might be listening in today? I'll start with, let's say, Ruka. Would you mind going first?
Yeah, thank you. I think the decision makers, when we talk about the Glasgow things, they also need to really make a very big decisions. The funding, the opportunity for the future should not be going to corporates again. And this is not only for the country, but also for the big funders that have been funding all these companies so far. What we need to do is we really need to build a better relationship between, as we see now, as we see now in across the globe, that cities are the most unsafe place under the sky today. And the safest place is indigenous territories where we still live in harmony with our nature. This needs to be, we need to build a new relationship. So it's not like we are in the remote area and we are the periphery and you are the central. I think we need to shift that, and then we build better connections, better how do we live together? How do we still support you? How do we provide you food? And we promise we can feed you. It's not Monsanto that is feeding you now. It is indigenous and local communities who are feeding you now during this difficult time. So this is the lessons of today. And we've proved also in our indigenous community that actually we don't know what people call in the city work from home. We don't know that because we are on lockdown. We produce food, we produce a lot of things. We are actually increasing our harvest during this difficult time. And this is the offer that we can offer now on our hand to the global community. But the first thing is, I want to tell the global leaders that the cheapest and most efficient investment is actually protecting and invest in indigenous people's rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruka. Powerful stuff. I'd stress, and if you have a look on the chat, all of these comments are being recorded. You can find a link on the comments. If you miss anything right now, you can catch it later. The last three contributions, and not too long if you don't mind, because I'm sure people have got to a lot of other places to get off to. Cahal, what's your views, your suggestion?
Thank you, Jonathan. I suppose it's simple in a way. It's governments need to wake up to the risks that indigenous peoples are facing, because if they don't, they're going to be complicit in the disappearance of these peoples. So first is waking up to that. And on the other hand, waking up to the value of their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, the services they provide to the planet. And we all know that we're at a point where we need some form of transformational change. It cannot be tinkering around the edges anymore. So the starting point for this, nobody has the solution, but the starting point is to meet with indigenous peoples on the basis of respect and equality, and to listen to what they have to say. And then together we can try to address this problem.
Thank you very much. Viviane, would you mind going next, and we'll have Camilo last.
Yo creo que apenas un principio
From the beginning, a very basic principle is the end of unilateral. No, we cannot take unilateral decisions on territories, indigenous territories, without their participation. So the main aspect is to bring an end to unilateral decisions.
And I guess that means giving a louder voice in these big international meetings, even if there's no internet, and even if you can't meet in person. Governments are going to have to find ways to do that. There has to be more support. If we're going to live in a more virtually connected world, then that support has to happen for that. And finally, Camilo, please, can you give us your suggestion?
Sí,
Camilo, I can see you. I can finally see you.
De acuerdo.
Mente te puedo ver.
Muchas gracias, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Efectivamente, estoy de acuerdo con Viviane.
Indeed, I do agree with Brian. The intervention of indigenous territories with states and corporations has to be built with consensus, and they have to hold talks with indigenous people. A policy, even if it's an excellent policy, even if we're talking of the COP meetings, has to be conducted with participation of indigenous people. We have to speak with the owners of these territories, and we're seeing this phenomena that they're not taking into account. And when discussing climate change, they're not taking into account participation of the owners of these territories, be these indigenous or not. Likewise, the main policies internationally are not taking into account the voice of indigenous people. So we urge the states, corporations, that although they may have very good intentions, they have to bear in mind the participation of indigenous people, and finally to demand states to guarantee the security of the territory, to avoid the informality that exists in many states in Latin America and globally. So that is the message. And finally, I'm fully convinced that it is possible to create an arena among humanity where we can all fit in despite our differences.
Thank you, Camilo, for that final comment, which is on a lovely, positive, engaging note. I think that's been the tone of this discussion. I've been delighted, despite the technical hitches. Lots of brilliant ideas, some grim reflections. The report itself, please read it. But please bear in mind all of these very positive messages. We have an audience here that is from all over the world in a wide variety of walks of life. We can see from the chat, which has been, I've enjoyed almost as much as the discussions themselves, lots of positivity in there and mutual support. I think there's a lot of good stuff been going on today in the midst of a bad situation. And I take a lot of encouragement from that. I hope you can all go out with that message that we've heard again and again. Please listen to the voices of indigenous and traditional peoples in the forests and other biodiverse areas. Please consider the positive developmental and health contribution that they can make. Please make them more central in debates. I hope we can all go out and spread that word a little wider. So I'll leave it there, and with a big thank you to everybody, my fellow panelists, and to all of you out in the audience who've contributed very much to this. I appreciate your participation and engagement, and I wish you all much better times ahead. Cheerio.